Hello class, and welcome to a quick discussion about liberalism. We just got finished talking about conservatism, so we're going to look at liberalism and kind of, where it comes from, liberal stances on things like social and fiscal issues, and, we're looking at the more liberal of the two parties today. It's definitely the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party is also the oldest of the two parties. The Democratic Party can actually date back to Thomas Jefferson, and of course political parties change and evolve, and so it's gone through massive changes of evolution. It did so with people like Andrew Jackson. There's an era known where Democrats many of them call themselves Jacksonian Democrats. During the Civil War, Democrats, especially in the South, were considered to be much more conservative than you would see Democrats today. As I touched upon in the last video, in the 1920s and the 1930s, Democrats started to become much more progressive in regard to the role of government in spending issues and regulation issues as a result of the stock market crash and how to handle the Great Depression. And a lot of what Democrats still kind of push today can go back to a time when, like, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was trying to create programs to put people to work at the expense of taxing the wealthy. And so, obviously after the Great Depression, you have World War II, the wartime economy, as well as afterwards, it's sort of sped up a lot. But even today, Democrats typically are champions of social programs, that especially work programs that help people get to work and help support them. And so, when dealing with programs like that allow for Pell Grants, that allow for like workforce training and compensation, workman's compensation, and things like that, typically those are things championed by the Democrats. They don't believe necessarily that it's easy for everybody just to pull themselves up by the bootstraps, so they think that government should find ways to help people. And so when dealing with fiscal issues, Democrats have, especially since the 1980s, when Republicans have started really championing the idea of giving tax breaks to wealthier people, Democrats have oftentimes made a counterpoint to that, and they typically argue that if you don't tax the wealthy, or if you give tax cuts to the wealthy, there's no guarantee that that actually trickles down to people in the middle class or people who are under the poverty line. Democrats believe that it's important to make sure that you use government in ways to try to regulate sectors of the economy so that people don't get taken advantage of. And as I mentioned in the last video, Republicans oftentimes like the idea of privatizing things. Democrats a lot of times think that it's not a bad idea to have things that are publicly controlled. And I think to a certain extent, when looking at things like the healthcare debate today, what you can see is sort of a clear divide between those who think, well, leave it completely to the private sector and just let it work out, versus those who say, well, the government really should be doing something to help control prices. And so you can still see sort of that conservative and liberal divide today. Liberals do typically argue that letting wealthier people have large tax breaks is probably not the best way to do things like provide programs and infrastructure to people. In addition to the fact, liberals oftentimes point out that it also adds a lot to the debt. And I don't know if you all have looked at the debt clock lately, but if you haven't, I suggest you Google it and take a look at it. So that's kind of with the fiscal issues. In contrast to that, liberals, you have to understand the word liberal actually comes from the Latin word libere, which means free. Liberals, when it comes to social issues, typically are more likely to support the idea that people have the freedom of choice. And of course, this comes in many different forms. And so I'll go over a couple of them with you. For example, when it comes to issues dealing with pro-life or pro-choice, Democrats or liberals typically are on the pro-choice side, believing that it's not really for the government to become involved in the private issues and decisions of people who are having children or may have children. When it comes to things like gay rights, you find a lot more support among liberals for things about dealing with gay equality, because the idea is people have a right to choose and make their own choices, and it's not really for the government to come in and try to kind of police people and their actions based upon what some people might believe. And so liberals are considered to be very open when it comes to people's lifestyle choices. And a lot of liberals argue that if you're not really hurting anybody, then you probably should be, granted the same protections as anybody else in society. But of course, there are other issues too. Liberals, in regard to things like immigration, typically come at it oftentimes with a more humanist argument, arguing that, when you have people trying to come into the country, we are a nation of immigrants. I don't know about all you watching, but I'm clearly somebody who's Caucasian. I'm not Native American. And so liberals oftentimes point out we're a nation of immigrants. Liberals sometimes say that that's one of our greatest strengths, the idea that we've had so many people come from different places to seek opportunity here. And we've often capitalized off of that desire and want to kind of build lives. And so liberals, for example, will sometimes accuse conservatives of being motivated by non-humanitarian things when it comes to issues dealing like with immigration. So another thing too, liberals traditionally, a lot of liberals are opposed to the death penalty. Liberals oftentimes cite the fact that most research shows the death penalty doesn't really serve as a deterrent. And so if it's not an actual deterrent to crime, it may not be the most humane thing to do to actually execute people as a form of punishment. I also want to mention when it comes to liberals, I do want to mention that liberals oftentimes will come to the aid of people who believe their rights have been infringed upon. So if you see, for example, legal cases brought by like the American Civil Liberties Union in regards to freedom of speech and freedom of religion and things like that, those organizations are oftentimes considered to be slightly more liberal because there is somewhat an idea that the individual should be protected, as long as he or she's not doing harm to somebody, then the government really shouldn't infringe upon them. And so hopefully this has kind of given you some just insight so that you can kind of contrast the two groups, and as well as the political parties that are currently representing them. One thing I do want to stress is that political parties change and they evolve, and their platforms change and they evolve. And so for many of you, especially you younger people out there, it's important to kind of keep up with what's happening in politics and what's happening with trends, because, quite frankly, you may vote a certain way today. In 30 years, you may decide, this party's changed a whole lot, or I've changed, and you may differ. There are certainly people who vote exactly like their grandparents did, but you have people sometimes who go, I know Grandpa was part of this party, but that's not really for me, so I vote a different way. And so it's just sort of important to just be aware of those changes. And I think certainly it's safe to say, we may be living in one of those times where politics are kind of changing a great deal right now. So again, if you, as always, if you have any questions or you need my help, please feel free to email me.